Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Need Some Introduction. I've been gone for a while, mostly watching the Olympics, nursing my family through a COVID outbreak, which somehow avoided me. And of course, this all happened while we were on vacation, no less. So sorry for my absence. There's quite a few topics I want to get around to. The Boys finale, the controversial House of the Dragon finale, a bunch of content new to Apple TV Plus some new Apple TV content just around the corner, a bunch of horror films, some very good ones that have come out recently that I'd like to round up at some point in the future, a box office roundup of the summer season, and Furiosa is coming to HBO Max this very weekend. So I'd like to review finally that film along with something that I've pre-recorded, which was a rewatch of all the Mad Max films. So how will I get these out? I'm not sure. There might be just a bunch of little episodes that I'll use to do some catch-up here. But today's episode will be about one of those horror films that have been flooding the summer season, and perhaps one of the biggest, the new Alien Romulus film, which I've just seen. In today's episode, I will be providing a spoiler-free recap of that film, followed by, I'm doing this after the fact, by the way, secondarily, a walkthrough of my revisitation of the entire Alien franchise, and a ranking of where the new Romulus film goes into that hierarchy. I'm actually doing that after the review because this film, Alien Romulus, you can actually go into it without having seen anything at all in the Alien universe. So given that, I'll give you that spoiler-free review off the top because a discussion of the previous films, the series itself, is kind of a spoiler for some of the things that come up in this latest film. And then at the end, all the spoilers on the latest film, along with my thoughts in how this fits into the mythology and what might be next in this franchise. Also, speaking of Furiosa, I couldn't help but think, and I'll probably draw these parallels when we get into the Furiosa conversation episode later, two series that began at almost the exact same time, dystopian science fiction, coming at the tail end of the 70s, this grim realism that was prevalent in the films of the 70s, and then transitioning throughout the 80s in that new style of films, and then two series that continue to this very day, who, in both cases, created a new genre or popularized the genre of film. So very quirky, very esoteric films that launch genres that continue, surprisingly, to this very day. And I throw into there something that even started earlier, which is the Planet of the Apes films, another dystopian franchise. Perhaps not coincidentally, all three of these have new chapters coming out this very year. So I couldn't help but draw those parallels, but right now, to kick things off, the review, Alien Romulus. Now, this latest film in the series comes from Fede Alvarez, the very talented director of Don't Breathe and the Evil Dead reboot from 2013, both films which I think are exceptional, mostly in how well constructed they are. He also has written the screenplay along with his writing partner, Rodo Sayugas, who also worked with him on those previous films. Fede Alvarez did have one misstep commercially with his reboot of the Girl franchise, The Girl in the Spider's Web. I've never seen the film, mostly because of its bad reputation, but maybe just to be a completist, I will check it out. I'm pretty sure that at the worst, the film would be competently put together, because Alien Romulus is, if nothing else, really competently put together. There is a beautiful use of practical effects here. I'm very tired of this over-reliance on computer effects, especially in horror films. I just rewatched the Prometheus Alien Covenant films for this podcast episode, and the special effects are really good in that film, the CGI. And yet, there's something still weightless and less threatening than these practical effects. Similarly, I rewatched Alien and Aliens, and especially Alien, the really tangible sense of the creature in all of its different forms, and especially the locations, the feeling that they are actually on these sets, these truly otherworldly and bizarre sets, is what makes that film iconic to this very day. And Alvarez, for the most part, really does an excellent job of channeling all of that. There are obviously computer effects done here, but almost everything done with the creatures, especially when they're interacting with the actors, seems to be done practically and beautifully done. And Alvarez does a really good job of aping the visual style of that first film, the Ridley Scott Alien film from 1979. And also, given the opening segments on this mining colony, really feels a lot like Blade Runner, something that has been hinted at in the past that maybe these are in the same shared universe. whether that be the case or not, it seems like Alvarez definitely wants us to feel like we are in this much more grounded version of this dystopian future. And he does it with some really subtle choices, even at the beginning in the opening sequence of the film here, when we're introduced to this small primary cast of characters. Rain, played by Kaylee Spaney, who we've just seen in Priscilla, playing Priscilla Presley, and of course in Civil War, the Alex Garland film. David Johnson from Industry. I don't know if he's coming back this season, was not in the premiere episode just this week. Yet another topic I'm going to have to be covering here on the podcast. But so memorable in the first 2 seasons of that series, playing Rain's adopted brother / robot. There's always an android in all these films. And even as we're just introduced to these characters initially, and we see the way the camera moves, the layers of these sets, combination, I'm sure, of special effects and sets, but the water on the window looking out into the mining village, this blackened moon that never gets sunlight, is very evocative, really sets a tone, and in very short order sets up this need that these characters have to escape this circumstance, even if this is a suicide mission. Now, as far as seeing this film without any other context, before I get into any of the plot breakdown, you can go in completely cold. You do not need to know anything. Maybe the basic premise, which I think everybody on the planet knows at this point, the concept of these creatures that incubate in humans and then eat them. And if you are a fan, even mildly, of this kind of movie, and definitely of the Alien films, I think you will at worst be entertained by this, because this is a thrill machine. It is evocative and suspenseful, just in setting the stage of things to come. And then about a third of the way through the film, maybe a little bit more, when the action begins, it just goes and goes and goes. For a film that's 2 hours long, there's well over an hour of nearly nonstop action. And things continuously compound, continuously escalate. And it is visually stunning. It's what you come to science fiction for me anyway, especially science fiction horror. It's not only thrilling and grotesque oftentimes, and in the spirit of previous Alien films, it takes some bizarre twists in the mythology it builds up around these creatures and the relationship to this corporation, which includes some of the really bizarre creature design, which I won't spoil here, but I mean that bizarreness in a complimentary way, because this series is a bizarre and perverse series of films. So it's in the spirit of the previous films. And in just about every way, I think Alvarez gives you what you want in an Alien film. Now, your mileage may vary on whether you just want to get the fan service you've been wanting. For me, it works really, really well, because I feel like this is table setting or resetting to the point where we can now take the franchise in a different direction, even though this is very, very indebted to the tone and the feel, and honestly, the lower stakes of that first film. And appropriately, it takes place within the first and second film. So if you are cold to the series and you want to watch something, definitely watch the first film. First of all, because it's an absolute classic. And second of all, because it feeds in directly to some of the Easter eggs, or most of the Easter eggs we see here. There are many Easter eggs here that tie into the much broader mythology, but if you want to get the vast majority of them, all you really need to do is watch the first film. And of course, what happens here at the end of this film sets up what actually happens in James Cameron's equally excellent, in a very different tone, Aliens 2. I should say Aliens, not Alien 2. On the negative side, I think that there might be some criticism that this lacks ambition, in the fact that every other Alien film, intentionally or not, took the franchise in a completely different direction. I find it funny now that there are probably some critics already complaining about that very thing, based on my quick perusal of the early reviews on Letterboxd. And yet, not these specific critics, but the general consensus was on some of the more bizarre previous iterations of this story. Those are mostly considered a failure by critics and definitely by audiences. And now, of course, this reversion to the norm is looked at slightly askance. I would say for me, I did not really like Prometheus and definitely didn't like Covenant, although there were obviously interesting things in the entire series. We'll get into that breakdown soon. So a reminder and a resetting of the mythology to its core DNA is refreshing in and of itself. And it also allows the franchise to go in many different directions, something that I felt is necessary, because the franchise had kind of run its course when you got to Alien Resurrection, and where would you go from there? And then after Prometheus and Covenant, I felt like that had really run its course as well. So as franchise management, I think they've done an excellent job in making this film, which, as I mentioned, has some incredible set pieces, has some real surprises, which I won't spoil here. We'll get to all of them in the spoiler section. But this is very solid. This is maybe my favorite film since the first two. I do feel like in recent years that Prometheus and Covenant have been reclaimed to some extent. And if those are your favorite films in the franchise and you want to see the series get more and more esoteric, you're going to be pretty disappointed with this. If your favorite film is Aliens, for example, this may not have all the action that Aliens has, although it's way more action-packed than, for example, the first Alien film. So once again, use that as your metric. I think if you like the original two films, if you like the weird, or like if we're Alien Resurrection, I don't know who that person is. Please email me if you think that, if you're that person. But if you think Alien Resurrection and the most bizarre aspects of that film are, by the way, are represented here in this film. It's interesting, kind of a consolidation. Alvarez is obviously a student of the franchise and has included elements of all the previous films. So it's all here, but mostly this is leaning into the roller coaster ride aspect of the film, which is really not what the first film is either, by the way. And I was really impressed with it. I thought just visually stunning. I get what I want in a lot of these type of science fiction films. The beautiful world building, the beautiful scenes of mass destruction, which is beauty of a certain kind. And just about all the suspense really works here. And there's something thematically going on here, which occurs in all of the Alien films as well. This constant concept of survival, of people in space, just an inch away from destruction, from the vacuum of space, yet trapped inside these locales with this species, which is also just trying to survive. And these two forms of survival, survival of a species, survival of the individual. And these things are constantly in tension with each other. And honestly, I think it's very well explored here without hitting you over the head with the themes in the way that, for example, Alien Covenant and Prometheus really were so thematically bogged down in philosophical discourse, they forgot to make an entertaining film. My mini review of those films, which I'll get into in much more detail, coming right up. As far as the plot goes, Rain, played by Kaylee Spaney, has an adoptive brother, an android, Andy, played by David Johnson, and very evocatively, some very efficient world building, in no small measure leaning into what we already know of this world. She lives on a mining colony. She thinks she's at a point where she's ready to opt out of her contract and dreams of going to this planet and seeing the sun. She lives on this mining colony where they don't see sun. Importantly, there are these rings around the planet, beautifully realized not only at the microscopic purview of being in this mining colony and the culture of it, once again reminiscent of the ground view, working class perspective of Blade Runner, as well as the Alien franchise, the original film, and the second one as well. Her parents have died working in the mines. She just discovers in these opening moments that her contract's been extended for another 10 years, apparently. And we have this very anti-corporate, which again is another theme of this entire franchise, idea of promising something that is never going to come, of basically turning these people into indentured servants. There's a bunch of young actors, another crew that she hangs out with, Tyler Kay, Bjorn Navarro. I'm not that familiar in any of these extended cast of characters. And what Tyler informs them of is that there is an abandoned research facility that is entering the orbit of the planet, or this moon, and is about to be obliterated by these rings within about a day and a half. But they're thinking if they can take one of the mining vehicles that Tyler pilots, it can get them into orbit, onto the ship, where they anticipate they'll be able to find escape pods and a vehicle with cryosleep capabilities, and they could use these to make it to this other planet they're trying to get to. This is all pretty convoluted, but in very short order, we understand that their options are pretty bleak, living this very limited lifespan on this, and probably dying on this mining colony. And of course, one of the main reasons they want to bring Rain along is the fact that she has Andy, this gift that she received from her father, who died from some lung infection due to his mining activities. And he had found this abandoned Wayland android and programmed him to do whatever was best for Rain. It was his only directive. And he very much early on is like a child, needs to be rebooted frequently, is very glitchy, and seems naive, to say the least. And Johnson does a really charming job here of playing this younger brother figure who's probably developmentally challenged minimally, if you want to read it that way. But since he is a cyborg, he is able to, or since he is an android, a Wayland android, he probably has access to open most of the facilities on that secondary ship. Once they arrive on the ship, it is a ghost ship, as you would expect in all these Alien films. There's almost always some ghost ship at some point in the proceedings, definitely in the very first film. But are they really alone? And of course, unintentionally, in trying to reboot the ship, they awaken what's living on that ship. And that's when the roller coaster ride begins. So it's pretty brief in getting to that point where the plot really kicks into action. Takes about half an hour or so, but all intriguing and beautifully visualized up until that point. And then, of course, as I mentioned, pedal to the metal, action-wise, and really a thrilling experience throughout most of it, or if not all of it. And the real standout here, Kaylee Spaney, totally solid in the performance she's trying to give. Very frustrating, as is often the case with these Alien films, the decisions these characters try to make. This is, hearkening back to the very first Alien film, a slasher film as well as many other things. And in the same way that characters make very stupid decisions in those films, it may feel that way here, but a little more rational here considering they don't really know what they're up against. And I'll wait for spoilers to talk about how I think that's actually thematically relevant in this particular case of this film, and this series as a whole, actually. But the real standout here is David Johnson playing Andy, where at one point he needs to have additional access granted to him, and they reprogram him with a disc from a medical android they find on the ship, at which he gets a whole new set of programming. And his pivot here into this very knowing archetype that we've seen, this cold and calculating and untrustworthy android character, another through line across all these films, just how much you can actually trust these androids. And his pivot into this different version of himself, and perhaps those two different programmings at odds with each other, is really interesting and adds a whole other layer of suspense to the film. Okay, so a big thumbs up for me. A lot of fun. I think if you're a fan of the franchise, at worst, you're going to like this. At best, you're going to feel like it's a refreshing reset of the franchise, which is what I felt. If you're one of those people that really likes the headier, most bizarre aspects of this series, and it does get super bizarre, we'll get into all that, you may find yourself disappointed. So reset your expectations. It's just the thrill ride. And on the opposite side, if you like the action and you like a thrilling slasher film set in space, then this is maybe the best version of that very product. As far as my box office predictions, I think this will, I have a question mark here actually. I think this will probably open 40 million. Word of mouth, I think, will be good. So I think it's going to track higher. Walk-up business will be good. And then internationally, I don't think it's going to break out the way that the star-studded and heavily advertised Prometheus film did. So let's say 250 million worldwide. That's my prediction right now. By the way, in a few weeks, I'll do a roundup after Labor Day on all the stuff I nailed 100% correctly. Deadpool, Wolverine, for example, and things that I missed completely, like The Fall Guy. So I'll give you my scorecard at the end of the season. Okay, so let's get into the series breakdown. So as part of my preparation for this podcast episode, I watched a documentary called Memory, The Origins of Alien from 2019. And there's actually quite a few documentaries about the making of Alien. And in this retrospective here, I'm probably going to spend most of my time actually talking about the film Alien, for the fact that there are few films like this that create a new monster into the popular culture, that in some ways or minimally popularize a subgenre or create a new genre. And I'll make the correlation to Mad Max as well. It's not to say that Mad Max, when it came out, especially in rewatching that first film, is not heavily indebted to motorcycle gang movies of the 50s and 60s, is not playing into the post-apocalyptic desert scapes of A Boy and His Dog, and obviously Planet of the Apes, the original. But once that movie came out, it became a new stake in the ground, a new signpost for when you say Mad Max, immediately you have a whole world that is envisioned along with it. It becomes shorthand for a bunch of other things. And Alien was that as well. Not to say that there were never space alien movies. It came from outer space, Planet of the Vampires, and many other films from the 50s and 60s that have a lot of shared iconography with that Alien film. Not only the monster that's killing people off on the ship, on the spaceship, not only these spooky, abandoned ghost ships. In the case of Planet of the Vampires, you have the remains of giant creatures strewn about the surface of the planet. All things that are definitely borrowed. But once Alien came out, from that moment on, every single time someone says there's a space horror film set on a spaceship, immediately everyone's thinking Alien. And of course, especially in the 80s and early 90s, there were many of these, usually cheap knockoffs. But this specific franchise, of course, continues to be popular and successful 50 years nearly into its history. So another huge inspiration for Dan O'Bannon, the writer of the Alien film. Oh, importantly, let me just point out the fact that Dan O'Bannon was in school with John Carpenter. They made a film called Dark Star, which is very funny, a comedic, but very dark science fiction horror comedy. And also a bunch of people on a ship dealing with a malfunctioning AI, with a shape-shifting alien on board, by the way, which is shaped like a giant beach ball. So the comedic version of this same story. Dan O'Bannon wanted to get credit for directing that film as well. That film, Dark Star, which John Carpenter directed, really became a calling card for him. It became a midnight movie, was pretty successful, and launched John Carpenter's career. And Dan O'Bannon felt disappointed that basically Carpenter had gotten a lot of traction from his career from that project. And he felt that he had directed it to a large extent as well. And he felt like that a lot of that prestige did not glom onto him as well. The next thing he worked on substantially was a Dune adaptation, which never happened, but was incredibly influential to all of the science fiction films that came after. And yet again, another documentary you could track down is called Jodorowsky's Dune. It's about the failed attempt to adapt Dune back in the mid-70s by Alejandro Jodorowsky, who had become a significant cult filmmaker of his own. From Mexico, he was, and had a couple of very successful psychedelic genre-bending midnight movies, El Topo and Magic Mountain, and had almost been able to raise about $10 million to make Dune, although the budget eventually ballooned even further and things fell apart. However, he went very far into producing this. Dan O'Bannon wrote the screenplay for the project. And most importantly, the design work, most of it was done by an artist called Giger from Switzerland, who made these extremely sexualized, phallic, truly terrifying. If you've ever seen Necronomicon, his book, his imagery is really nightmare-inducing, and had done a lot of the design work for this Dune adaptation, and him and O'Bannon became friends. So then O'Bannon writes his own adaptation. He goes back to Dark Star and says, why don't I make that as a straight-up horror film? And writes the screenplay and pulls in all these references I mentioned, these other previous films. He does some of his own design work, by the way, very talented artist, and creates these cicada-like bug creatures in his version of the story. His screenplay is very close to what we get in the finished product. And originally, he gets a green light from 20th Century Fox, who's just coming a year or so after the massive success of Star Wars, to make a very low-budget version, about $2 million version of the film. And then it's always interesting when I see how these productions come together and how something truly excellent is almost accidentally made. That cheap film suddenly gets a budget upgrade to about $10 million. First of all, because there's a real appetite for science fiction again after the massive Star Wars film. Fox, of course, willing to invest in another space project, although this is a horror film explicitly as written. But we are now coming after the slasher film boom. So all of a sudden it feels like maybe a slasher film, feels like science fiction, obviously a sci-fi film. So they're interested in testing the waters if they can get a director that they trust behind the camera. Then comes Ridley Scott, who initially is not interested in science fiction at all, but for some reason really likes the script, and in his head can immediately see the potential of the project. He'd had a minor success with his first film, The Duelist, and also was very famous as a commercial director. So they're able to get this $10 million budget together. And Ridley Scott is very interested in making the film very much in the tone of this hyper-realistic 70s style, which was at its peak in the mid-70s. So really not wanting the film to feel like the antiseptic sci-fi that we had seen previous to this period of time. He wanted to feel basically like they are inside of a oil rig and that they're people of that class, working class people. So that's the second component. And then, of course, the third component is when Scott starts to immediately start storyboarding everything out. And he goes to O'Bannon and starts talking about what the creature is going to look like. And O'Bannon goes, you got to see this guy's work, Giger. And he shows him the Necronomicon, and they find an actual creature in there, which is almost identical to the design for the alien that we get. Of course, at the time, everything is practical. This is before computer effects, or at the very, very beginning of any kind of computer effects. And that's the other really incredible thing about the film. Veronica Cartwright, one of the actors in the film, in the original Alien, mentioned how she showed up on set for the first time in the planet set where they find the giant engineer inside of the pilot seat, and also where they find the eggs. And that these massive sets had been built, and lit the way they appear in the film, and they were just utterly blown away. Like they were inside of a haunted house, basically. And I think that is why so many films you see from the early 80s, for example, when all of a sudden they get a really pristine 4K restoration and you see them again in digital, you see too much. You see how the special effects are done. You can see the blue screening. You can see sometimes the colors leaching through the layers of the special effects. And it's almost as if the more you see it, the more clearly you see it, the more high resolution, the weaker it looks on screen. Not the case for Alien, which I revisited a few years back. The more high resolution this is, the more beautiful and detailed and scary it is to a large extent, because the alien creature is this very well-formed, beautiful suit that's being worn by these different actors, puppets sometimes people in suits. And they're in the frame with the actors, interacting with them. And the sets, usually covered with some kind of moisture, are so incredibly well designed and so immense that it's completely immersive. And there were some decisions about the pacing of the film that Fox was not so excited about. They started to worry about the budget, although they did not go over budget. They worried about these long sequences early in the film where they're talking about their union dues and going on strike, and this relationship between the workers and the corporation, which interestingly is seated at this moment and continues throughout the entire series. And the film just became another phenomena in the United States and around the world. It made $180 million approximately, the rare film at the time that made more money overseas than in the US. It's been re-released multiple times, it's been very successful in its re-releases. Fox has probably made many times over its investment just in the reissues, the DVDs, the Blu-rays, the special editions, the director's cuts. Every few years there's some new edition and some new documentary that reignites interest in the original product. And just for reference point, that $180 million or so would adjust to around $700 million today on a budget that would probably adjust to $40 to $50 million. So a true massive success. And you don't even need to question whether it's a success or not. Whether you have seen this movie or not, we all know what the alien is. We know what the basic premise is. And we know what that alien looks like. And as an experience, it's so clever that it is such a mix of so many things. Dan O'Bannon, in an interview years ago, said that he didn't steal from anybody when he wrote that screenplay. He stole from everybody. And that's okay. That when you mix things together in a new way, you get something new. It's something that feels fresh. And it's pretty incredible what they fit together here. You have the haunted spaceship, which is something we've seen before. And it's a true haunted house movie. As a matter of fact, the pacing of this film for so long feels like the pacing basically of Robert Wise's The Haunting, like a very slow-paced, slow-burn ghost story. And for a large part of this film, almost half of it, it feels like it is at that pace. And of course, we have this beautiful camera roving through the hallways, just observing the characters, almost as if it is some kind of spectral presence itself. By the way, the camera operated by Ridley Scott himself. This is just at the onset of Steadicam, and he is carrying this camera around, choosing what to look at different times, following the actors through these corridors and through these beautiful sets, these giant alien sets. And like I said, it is very fluid, beautiful in a restored high definition DVD if you get a chance, or Blu-ray if you get the chance to see it. The streaming edition, there's a 4K version of that as well, highly recommended, and all operated by, or mostly operated by, Ridley Scott himself without Steadicam. There's some pretty hilarious things about this. This film came out, had an R rating. You can find YouTube videos of, I remember seeing these advertisements when I was younger. They had alien dolls that would shoot out the little jaws inside. They thought this was going to be popular with the kids. They was going to sell toys just like they sold toys for the Star Wars films. Not quite the audience they ended up attracting, but of course, creating a truly iconic new monster. And of course, not necessarily turning into a cash cow for toys for young kids, but there's definitely a collector's market for many of these beautiful alien designs. And as I started saying before, it's a combination of a haunted house story. Hey, did you like Jaws, where there's a threat that this giant super predator is going to eat you? How about this thing impregnates you and then it pops out of you and then eats you? It's a little bit of Jaws. It's a little bit of Rosemary's Baby. It's a little bit of Deliverance, by the way, because there's male rape intentionally. You see in these documentaries, the actual filmmakers talking about having male rape sequences in the film itself as a theme. something that had appeared in earlier 70s films, these more transgressive blockbusters like Deliverance, just to name one. And there is this anti-corporate sentiment there as well, which was a hot button topic there, especially in England. Remember that Ridley Scott is British. And the breaking up of the unions was a big deal during Reagan's era, but even more so, a big cultural shift in England at the time under Margaret Thatcher. So it's no coincidence that these people spend a lot of time talking about how much bonus money they get and how they get screwed over by the corporation and how they no longer get protected by the unions. And somehow this weird amalgamation of things created something, a primal fear in these creatures, which of course are also insect-like, which people are always terrified of insects, and very sexual, right? We have the phallic and vaginal imagery within the creatures themselves. So it is just like a bunch of nightmare scenarios all packed together onto one spaceship. And of course, space itself is terrifying, right? When you watch a film like Gravity, just the thought that you're in space, that you're inside the ship, and that just inches away, just outside of that thin veneer of metal, is the vastness of space, which will swallow you whole, and the insignificance of humanity in that regard. And now, of course, your safe space, the spaceship itself, is the bigger risk. And of course, the film itself is just about survival. It's just the need to fight and survive at all costs, even if it's only for one more day. So in those ways, it feels like it is thematically related to war films as well. The Vietnam War, of course, just becoming thematically popular within American films. There had been relatively few Vietnam War films, but suddenly late in the 70s, we saw a slew of very popular ones. But of course, in this regard, the aliens are survivors as well. The survival of the species versus the survival of the individual. And of course, this, once again, foundationally in that very first film, is thematically what all of these films are about afterwards. So many of these things were almost accidentally, you can imagine they're just trying to make a thrill ride. They take it much more seriously than expected. They create a truly iconic monster. And then as a byproduct, you then start to see these themes emerging. And then, of course, as the series progresses, all of this becomes more relevant over time. And then, of course, the film comes out and completely overperforms. Despite the huge success of the first Alien film, it actually took 7 years to make the sequel. There's a popular story that some producers that had little faith in the success of the first Alien film basically tried to sabotage any kind of sequel for so many years just because they had this petty jealousy of having been wrong over the success of the film. But as is usually the case with these type of stories, it's actually a little more complicated than that. The reality was that they were curious to have another film, but they were afraid that the budget would be too high. Remember, at this time, sequels almost always made less money than the previous film. To talk about some huge hits from this period of time, The Cannonball Run, Smokey and the Bandit, both significantly less successful in their sequels. The Exorcist 2, huge disaster. Jaws 2, a blockbuster, but made significantly less. Superman 2 made half as much. Ghostbusters 2 made half as much. So now it's this idea that the success of the first film grows into the second film, but that was not the case at the time. You assumed you were going to lose almost half your business, and that's if the people liked the films. If people rejected the films, like Exorcist, for example, or even Jaws 2 to some extent, the films made significantly less money. The second point is that even though Alien eventually was hugely profitable, it didn't all happen all at once. And there was some kind of anticipation early on that maybe they would sell toys and things like that this would be a new Star Wars-like franchise. And that certainly did not end up being the case with an R-rated film. So it was only a few years later when Fox looked at their IP and thought, well, you know what? We should make another Alien film. And then just at that time, in the early 80s, when they started having these thoughts, Ridley Scott had made Blade Runner, utterly iconic now, but a flop at the time when it came out, lost a lot of money. And that very same summer, as E.T. was being massively popular, so sci-fi was booming, John Carpenter, to bring up his name again, had made The Thing, another shape-shifting alien, very dark, R-rated, in a lot of ways, definitely got the green light due to Alien. But of course, that had been a huge flop as well. So Fox is thinking, I don't know if we can get away with putting another Alien film out. There may not be an appetite for it, and all indications are that it probably won't do that well. But just a couple of years after that, James Cameron made The Terminator, another R-rated, very bleak horror sci-fi film. And he supposedly made a pitch where he wrote Alien on a whiteboard. This may be apocryphal as well. Put an S at the end of it and put dollar signs through the S, dropped the marker and walked out the door. and he got the green light. I don't know if that's actually true or not, but they did give him $18 million, which was more than twice as much money as they'd given to The Terminator. And by the way, The Terminator, huge hit on home video, not a huge hit when it was in theaters. So all the ideas that, well, this is a no-brainer, you make another Alien movie, not necessarily the case at the time. But thanks to Cameron's clout, and of course, one more X factor here, Sigourney Weaver had just had a huge hit in '84, the Ghostbusters film itself. All of a sudden, Sigourney Weaver's profile is much higher. Cameron, his next project, people are hot for it. And Cameron pitching it as an action movie, straight up action movie. Ripley and Soldiers was his pitch. And he had just written the script for the hugely successful Rambo First Blood Part 2, which was completely bastardized, but nonetheless definitely helped him get his pitch off the ground. And all of a sudden, people were more interested. Oh, we have the action movie hook of Rambo. Obviously, this is the peak of Schwarzenegger and Sylvester Stallone. Of course, Schwarzenegger's about to have a huge sci-fi horror hit himself with Predator. And long story short, the film comes out in '86. Production goes pretty smoothly, a pretty big production. And the film is a major hit, making over $150 million on an $18 million budget. Adjusted for inflation, this is still a big step down from the first Alien film, but hugely profitable. And this was a really successful film and very well respected, and got Sigourney Weaver an Academy Award nomination. In rewatching this one, it's very interesting to see it in today's context. You see Cameron's visual style versus Scott's, that blue filter on everything. And of course, his absolutely clear-eyed and beautiful action choreography, something that is, to this day, I mean, if you've seen my review for Avatar: The Way of Water, I absolutely love that film because it has a 1-hour action climax. It just builds and has character in there, and it's just really perfect action directing. And so is Aliens. Aliens is just an absolutely perfect action movie. The last hour also just like one action crescendo after another. The themes of the film and the character beats and the action plotting all coalesce it just perfectly. And once again, I have to say, I just love something that we're probably going to miss in our over-reliance on CGI. Watching the film again just this week, love the beautiful practical effects, the real explosions, the miniatures. It's a combination of these large sets with miniatures actually exploding on rear projectors and the actors actually throwing themselves over rocks and things in the foreground. Really just expert, low to medium budget film production. And it just holds up. It still looks terrific in this day and age. And I honestly just think that unless you are making an Avatar, a lot of the visuals we see now are not going to hold up in even 10 years, much less 20, 30 years, 40 years. Other than just jaw-dropping special effects, we have thematically, again, this toxic corporate mentality. And we'll see even more and more as the films progress, this alignment, the corporation's admiration for these insects. And when you think about a corporation, the corporation's goal is to protect the corporation, and the individuals don't matter. And that is how these insects think as well and how they coordinate. So very much this film series is aligning corporate think with these insect-like predators. And you may think that that is some kind of socialist claptrap or something, but it's actually more deep than that, because it's not saying all the time, especially when you get into some of the later films, the corporation think is necessarily wrong. Because in the long run, these individuals oftentimes make terrible decisions. And I think the filmmakers are trying to show us that maybe the insects are right. Thus, maybe the corporate think is actually better than the overly sentimental thought that our supposed quote-unquote heroes have in these films. Because this is a very, very cynical series beyond the second film. The second film is maybe the most optimistic film of this entire franchise. And that's another thing that makes it an outlier. By the way, since we're in kind of semi-spoiler territory, no spoilers yet fully for Romulus, but if you didn't suss that out from the material, the advertising, and some of the things I've said until this point, Romulus takes place directly in between Alien and Aliens. So I would recommend, if you've seen nothing, or if you don't remember these films very well, rewatch Alien, then watch Romulus. It will accentuate what you will see in Romulus. And then watch Aliens if you haven't already, because Aliens, before you watch Romulus, might actually spoil a couple of things. Just when you think about the fact that there are some of these places that are actually shared between those two films. So you kind of know how it turns out, let's say. And then that's really all you need to see. If you see Alien and Aliens, you see two extraordinary films. Aliens takes Alien, the original, and explores the same material in a completely different context. Now you have a military hive mind versus this insect hive mind. And you've added another theme here, this theme of motherhood, especially in the director's cut of Aliens, if you've ever seen that. There is this real tragic moment that is cut out of the theatrical version where Ripley arrives at home decades later and communicates with her daughter, who's now an old woman, because it's been decades since she's disappeared. And it's really tragic. And of course, that's something that was maybe hitting the mother theme, maybe one beat too many, or maybe it made the film too long. But there is a real theme of motherhood here in this film. Ripley suddenly becoming a surrogate mother to Newt. And of course, paralleling that with this alien mother, a new creature here in the mythology. And of course, in this chronology, let's say, we drop Romulus there in the middle. And if those are the three films we work on from this point on, maybe prequels and sequels, there's a TV series which I think takes place at around the same time as this film, the current Romulus film. And that's been pushed out to 2025. I had originally announced in the podcast that was coming in 2024. I was very much looking forward to it. Looks like they've pushed it out a few more months, so we'll probably get it early next year. So I think that is probably all you need to interact with the franchise popularly in the moment. And beyond that point, this franchise gets really, really weird, really, really fast. Then comes Alien 3. This is David Fincher's very first movie. Very important for Fincher's career. Fincher felt like he made this film for all the wrong reasons. It was an opportunity. They gave him a release date. They gave him a big budget. But all these things ended up being constraints on his career. And as a matter of fact, if he hadn't had 7 already lined up as his follow-up, this could have very well destroyed his career. But of course, 7 comes along and is a massive, massive blockbuster. And the rest is history there. A few things that end up being almost the pattern here early on is that you take an up-and-coming visionary director, first with Ridley Scott, then with James Cameron, and then with David Fincher, and that they reinvent the film. They basically throw out the playbook and start with a whole new genre practically. The first film, an amalgamation of haunted house, slasher film, body horror, space survival film, questions about our creation of artificial intelligence. So it's 2001. It's got a little bit of Jaws. It's got a little bit of Cronenberg in there. A weird stew that creates its own genre. The second film goes and turns up the action all the way, mixes it explicitly with a war film. If the first film asked questions about our involvement in Vietnam and this guerrilla warfare and how we can't win when we can't see our enemy, Aliens is a straight up action movie. And if that's what you wanted, boy, Alien 3 was such a huge disappointment. I remember seeing this one in the theaters. I also saw Aliens in theaters. Did not see Alien. I was way too young to see Alien in theaters. But I did see Aliens in the theater as a teenager and Alien 3. I would say this is closest to a Dracula movie. And when I say that, I don't mean a vampire movie. I mean a Dracula movie. Dracula, the book, came from this reaction to plague stories, right? That people are getting sick and dying around you. You don't know what's killing them. And then the mythology that they might come back from the dead or that they were buried while they were still alive, died from consumption. It's really almost like a plague metaphor. And that's what Alien 3 is. It's extremely meditative. It is about being afraid to get attached to any of these people that could die at any time. And people just rejected this film, by the way, which I saw in theaters. And I remember people groaning in the cold open of this film. Newt and Hicks die. They die before the credits finish rolling. Ripley survives. And she is on this prison colony for violent sexual predators. Now, as I mentioned before, the Aliens film is the only one that has a pro-humanity optimism to it. Well, that is completely absent from this film. This film is incredibly bleak, and it is basically about a bunch of people knowing that they're going to die. Basically, these prisoners are just waiting to die anyway. And just the acceptance of that. And for me, the film worked. Even at the time, I remember when people were so angry at this film that it worked for me because I was one of those people, like everybody else in the theater, who could not believe that they had killed Newt in the cold open of the film. And in the same way that Ripley needs to come to terms with that, so do we. And then by the end of the film, there is this acceptance of that. Critics have actually mentioned that this is maybe a metaphor for the different stages of grief and coming to terms with this loss and this death. But anyone who expected the action from earlier films was not getting that. It obviously does have that structural slasher movie structure where people are killed one at a time. But there's that absence of the struggle, the humanity to survive given their grim consequences. So once again, it's more about accepting that death rather than fighting against it, which is very different than the other films in the franchise. And some incredible visuals. So only if you are a Alien completist, if you are a casual viewer who likes not jump scares, but the Alien thrills, that survival horror thrills that the Alien franchise gives, this film does not give you those things. But if you like the more esoteric, thoughtful aspects of the franchise, this is where the series begins to allow itself to be weird. It allows itself to be weird, and boy, it gets weird. This was a summer kickoff, May of 1992, I believe was the year it came out. It was supposed to be a big blockbuster for the summer, and it was a huge flop, had a huge opening weekend, dropped off immediately after that. But it made over $100 million overseas and produced for around $60 million. And that's included a lot of reshoots. There was a lot of trouble in producing this. They spent millions of dollars getting this thing off the ground multiple times. This is a whole digression on just this film. The failed attempts to get this thing off the ground. There was one where they were living on a wooden planet, literally a wooden planet. There's so many bizarre takes on this film, and different elements of all those scripts ended up in this final script. And they ended up reshooting big chunks of it to put more action into it at the end. So the fact that it kind of is as cohesive as it is shocking given the complete disaster that the production was for this thing. It's interesting. If you are a big completist about David Fincher, you see a lot of Fincher's talent here in crafting suspenseful horror sequences and his impeccable visuals, his judicious use of special effects that are very effective here. But for the casual viewer, definitely not. So if you're a completist for Fincher's work or for the Alien franchise, you'll probably find some pretty interesting things here. Some of you may really love this, but in general, not for everybody, for sure. Maybe not for anybody is the following film. It took 5 years to follow up Alien 3, and there was so much internal dialogue about how they had screwed up the franchise, and then they go and give Jean Junot, the French director, who makes this film after Delicatessen and City of Lost Children, by the way, before he makes Amelie. So his huge breakout success, the hundreds of millions of dollars and dozens of Academy Award nominations that he gets for Amelie comes after Alien Resurrection. They hire him to do the sequel before he's even made Amelie. And man, if you think the last film is an acquired taste, wait till you see this one. Ripley, who dies at the end of Alien 3, is resurrected from her DNA, but her DNA is merged with that alien DNA. So she's part human, part alien. She's on a new ship with the android this time, played by Winona Ryder, giving a strange performance here for an android. And if you know Jean Junot's style, there is a lot of this quirky, clownish comedy in an alien film. Really bizarre. Now, as I mentioned, this is only for the loyalists, only for the completists. This is the worst of this whole entire franchise of films, undoubtedly. And even then, you'll find things that are interesting here. There is some incredible visuals here. Not only the special effects work, which is very convincing, some pretty decent action sequences, which Jean Junot is not really known for, but he's able to pull off the straight action, as well as this more kind of mousetrap type logic that he has in all his other films. But this goes in a really intriguing direction towards its end. It really goes where even most of the other films have not been able or have not tread, where we have a sex scene between Ripley and these aliens. They won't actually consume her because they sense their own DNA within her. And somehow by bonding with her, these experiments that have been going on have introduced too much human DNA. And there's this really impressive, actually, honestly, the ending of this film works pretty well. This hybrid, almost human-like child is born, grotesque, truly grotesque, and kills its alien mother and then bonds with Ripley. And then Ripley, who of course has this thwarted maternal instinct throughout this entire series, uses this maternal bond to destroy this creature. The ending is really powerful, and the rest of the film is kind of a disaster. So take that as you will. Like I said, even the worst of these films have merits to them. And here's another crazy thing about this film that, if you haven't seen it, does not seem in any way commercially viable. And yet this franchise, people don't, to some extent, the diehards don't mind how weird this thing gets, because produced for $70 million and made around $150 million, and that was mildly profitable. So the franchise was not yet dead. I'll just spend a minute talking about the Alien versus Predator. That's where the franchise went next. There was a very popular comic book series, Alien versus Predator. The first Predator film, of course, had come out around the time of Aliens, and there seems to be some shared DNA there. They're both from Fox, so of course they could play with the material. We had seen alien remains in those Predator films. So one of the species that these predators hunt. And Paul W.S. Anderson, not P.T. Anderson, but Paul W.S. Anderson, made the first absolutely trashy, but I gotta say, I like some of Paul W.S. Anderson's films. He made the OG Mortal Kombat, dumb but fun. Event Horizon, really dumb, but beautifully designed. Soldier, Resident Evil. And the first Resident Evil film, I think, is actually really entertaining. The rest of them are pretty terrible, although he's made most of them. And he's still making movies. He just made Monster Hunter, which I did not see. Some people enjoy it for its trashiness. I very much liked just how absolutely stupid this teaming up of Alien and Predator was, but it gives you what's written on the box and relatively entertaining. But if you haven't watched them, no reason to watch them. And by the way, Alien vs. Predator Requiem, which came out in 2007, was such an utter disaster that it killed any of this Alien vs. Predator sidequels that were going on. Although I think even that one made some money, so who knows? They might revive this thing in the future again. And then Ridley Scott finally comes back to the franchise, supposedly hiding the fact that he's making an Alien prequel by calling it Prometheus. And then he also makes Covenant. Prometheus ended up making $400 million worldwide, but its budget was still so substantial that this was kind of considered a disappointment. And I just rewatched Prometheus. I remember seeing Prometheus in IMAX when it first came out. And I think I was in San Francisco working at the time. And I saw it right away, first day, second day, maybe that it was out. And boy, I was so disappointed with this film. And it was the very first time I'd seen it again to rewatch for this podcast episode. And what I'd say is it's not as bad as I remember it being, because I really didn't like it at all when I saw it. And what I'd say in retrospect is that it is still a really bad script, I think, but impeccably made. And it has one truly redeeming characteristic, which is Michael Fassbender playing David. But other than the absolutely beautiful design work, this is all CGI special effects, I believe, at this point, but really well done. I still prefer the practical effects. But especially in Covenant, when you see the aliens racing on the outside of the surface of the spaceship, for example, it's like beautiful. It's just really beautifully done. Really terrific special effects. And yet, I prefer the practical effects. But it is maybe the best the creatures look. So if you really fetishize the creature design, you definitely want to see these films. Otherwise, I don't think this is successful. The mythology here is so muddled. And I also saw Covenant, by the way, which is more of a straight-up horror film and came a whole 5 years after. And I believe there was still intended to be a third film. I do not know where the franchise was going to go. These are prequels, by the way. So Prometheus, and then Alien Covenant, and then theoretically a third film, which would lead into Alien. Now, just one thing, I can nitpick these films for just the muddying of the mythology so many different ways. But in a nutshell, the thing that bothered me so much in seeing these films again really crystallized this second time around, especially rewatching the films in close proximity. It's suddenly going back and seeing this juggernaut ship in Prometheus and understanding the mythology of the engineers and everything else, and making that so central to the mythology of this whole entire series, going all the way back to the first Alien film, which was made as just a spooky haunted house film, and seeing that giant engineer, this giant remains of this giant creature that had been thwarted by this hive mind insect, it once again is this metaphor of the smallness of being a human being, obviously, but humanity in general, in the grandness of space, that this much more technologically advanced and much more physically superior creature was destroyed by these insects, basically. So when we get to this prequel series and we find out, no, the engineers actually created these creatures as biological weapons, and they were about to use them against humanity because they created humanity and now they wanted to destroy them because we disappointed them. I don't know what the purpose of this is. Not that that in and of itself is a terrible premise for a film, or asking these questions. If, like, imagine you met your creator and then found out that they hated you, is powerful for sure. But to pigeonhole that into the Alien franchise, I don't understand how this enriches the Alien franchise at all. What it does allow is, once again, this really fascinating exploration of our relationship with AI, for example. That if we create a bunch of AI to do our bidding and then we reject them when they show signs of usurping us in some way, then what are the consequences of that? And of course, David is a truly fascinating character, even as this franchise fails in general, this mini side franchise, because he decides if he cannot be respected by humanity, then he will perfect the creatures that will eventually destroy humanity. And that's fascinating. And you could have that storyline without this engineer mythology, which I think now is really the thing that bothers me the most about this subset of the franchise. Because I think it is very interesting, and I think Scott is very interested in this part of the mythology, this idea of whether it is your children that want their own autonomy and are neglected by their parents, a direct metaphor here in this series, but just our current relationship to AI, more relevant than ever, when there are indications over and over again that David is jealous, David is selfish, is lustful, and because he does not fit into these people around him, he's surrounded by these people who he does not fit into their definition of a sentient being. So therefore, he undermines them simply because they can't see what's right in front of them. And I think that is a really, really interesting theme, which could have been explored even more fully and does not require this additional extraterrestrial layer of the engineers, and how this coincidence of seeing this engineer, which has been devoured from the inside by one of these alien creatures, and now suddenly that becomes central to the entire mythology and the Juggernaut ship itself. I just don't appreciate it, to be totally honest. Yeah, and then I think about it in the context of Covenant. That is still pre-Alien 1, and I think to myself, okay, so now where does that leave us, right? We have David now pretending to be this other android. By the way, spoilers here if you've never seen Covenant. And he's going to continue his experimentation on all of these colonists. So the idea is that this is 100 years before we get to the first Alien film. So theoretically, the Weyland Corporation is going to find out about these creatures, which of course is probably why they're interested later in the series. But then how does the engineer resurface that now there is yet another planet with an engineer on it? Because that's not the planet we saw in Prometheus. This is yet another planet. It's not what we saw in the flashback in Covenant either. Yet another planet. So I don't know what is going on here with this engineer mythology yet again, and how it ties into the rest of the aliens. And it doesn't add to it. It doesn't, unfortunately. But like I said, all these films, even the worst of them, have their merits. And the David character is truly a fascinating character. And Fassbender, especially giving this dual performance in Covenant, is really fascinating. It's nearly worth the price of admission. Which, of course, leads us to Alien Romulus. So here come the spoilers for Alien Romulus. So Fede Alvarez in Romulus does a really beautiful job of stylistically matching what we saw in the first Alien film. In the first moments of the film, we see that there is a ship that has captured the alien, that has somehow cocooned itself in space, the alien that is jettisoned at the very end of the first Alien film. That's when we meet Rain, who's waking up from a dream, another dream she's had of a sunrise, a sun she has not seen in years. She lives on this mining colony, presumably the mining colony that we revisit in Aliens. She has this adoptive brother, an android that was gifted to him by her father. And she discovers early on that she's basically going to be an indentured servitude to this mining corporation, to the Weyland Corporation, forever, which encourages her when she goes and meets with her group of friends to go on this near suicide mission, trying to get into this orbiting, doomed research vehicle destined to smash into the rings of this planet. And there's a question right away from us who are savvy about the franchise, of course, as to whether Weyland is intentionally destroying this project, basically. We soon discover, and we assume, going into this, that the ship is a ghost ship, as far as humans go anyway. And if this thing is orbiting a Weyland facility, you would assume they know it's there. So why aren't they doing something about it? Probably because they're trying to destroy it. So once again, if we believe this, then Weyland pivots later on in trying to save these creatures, because they seem to be fully aware at this moment that this is a very dangerous technology. All these interiors are really beautifully designed. All of I don't know if they're using the volume for what the actors are seeing out their windows, or if this is just post-production on special effects, but beautiful design work in creating these images. There's a device introduced early on that the ship is resetting its gravitational pull on a schedule. So they have no gravity, and then they have gravity again. So they're bouncing up and down constantly until they reactivate the gravity permanently. You know that's going to pay off later in the plot, of course. Their plan was to cryogenically freeze themselves and then set themselves off to this far planet, this planet that Rain has been dreaming about. But it turns out that the cryogenic containers do not have enough life support. So they head over to the main part of the ship, assuming that in the medical facilities they'll have more cryogenic packs. And this is a big mistake, of course. Rain finds out that one of her friends is pregnant, and she stays behind conveniently while the rest of them go exploring the remainder of the ship. In attempting to take the cryogenic packs out, they allow the temperature to drop in the medical facilities where, of course, these alien creatures are being housed. And as soon as they start to thaw out, dozens and dozens of these facehuggers, they start to break out, and they're looking for hosts. Andy has to be rebooted. Andy's been rebooted multiple times here. It turns out he needs rebooting frequently, but they also have found a medical officer, android, that's been nearly completely obliterated by an acid attack from one of the creatures. And they take this little disc he has and implant it in Andy. And Andy suddenly, this is a really brilliant performance turn here by David Johnson, becomes this much more adept. And once again, there is this thematics of your expectations of your children across all of these films. And you see Rain seeing him as this younger brother that she needs to constantly protect. And all of a sudden it becomes this incredibly capable character, and how she bristles against that. Turns out these facehuggers can move really well in water. I'm sure people will complain about this, but they are kind of like horseshoe crabs, definitely like crustaceans. So not too hard to believe that these things could move through the water. And just when it looks like they've got escaped, one of these facehuggers latches onto Navarro's face, one of these red shirts that have come along on the trip. And this is when Andy gets the idea to reconnect the medical officer, which turns out to be twist number 1, Ian Holm, reprising a version of his performance from the first Alien film. Ian Holm, who passed away, by the way, so I guess this is either AI or an impersonation of his voice, and his face basically mapped onto this partial body. And he tells them what they need to do is to run away. This is actually good advice. So I'm not sure if he was trying to still get the creature off the ship. I guess maybe he'd assumed that they're taking Navarro with them, with the ship, with the creature attached, so that would kind of do the trick. Rain gets the idea of freezing the tail of the thing so it won't break her neck while they detach it. But of course, we know she's been impregnated. Rook even tells them that there's a 60-40 chance that she's been impregnated. So he is kind of giving them the option. It's almost as if he just knows that they're going to make the wrong choices. And thematically, this is really relevant to this entire franchise. The idea that these people are making these dumb mistakes, going back, putting their lives back on the line, always trying to rescue one person. And that seems noble on paper, except for the fact that it's the wrong choice for the survival of humanity, for their own survival, for the survival of the group. And it's interesting that they disparage a decision that one of these androids has made earlier on to allow 3 people to die to rescue 12 others. And that's seen as an ignoble thing. And perhaps it is, but if it's the difference between the group surviving or not, it does seem to be the pragmatic thing. So I guess that's the question here, between the cold calculation of the android, the cold calculation of this perfect species, these bugs, versus the non-pragmatic emotional decision-making of the humans, which is explicitly said here, by the way, by the Ian Holm character. David's been infected with this new programming, so now he has another mandate. And that mandate is not only to protect Rain, his original mandate, but also to do what's best for the corporation. But even when theoretically, ironically, you would think that it's his counter-programming that's activating, when he's actually trying to kill Navarro, he's actually trying to do the best thing for Rain, because she is the risk. She is infected. She spawns one of these xenomorphs, although she's quarantined herself in this escape hatch, and the ship is now on an accelerated course into this ring system that surrounds the planet. The positive side of that, from a survival of humanity situation, is that incinerating this entire thing would keep it from spreading. And of course, that is part of the ironic power of these films, that you, rooting for humanity's survival, are actually vested in no one surviving the film. Because if someone survives and they're infected, then we are all doomed. And that is the fascinating tension of this. In the moment, rooting for our protagonists to survive and kill the aliens, and yet secretly hoping that they will all die because that means that the species can survive. And then what begins with one xenomorph, this newly birthed one, hunting down, very slasher-ish, but is also combined with these very mobile facehuggers, dozens of them at least. And there's a great moment that puts all these tensions directly into perspective, where Kay, the pregnant friend, is trapped behind this door. They're asking David to unlock it, but he can see the alien is right there. And he's like, if we open the door, we're all going to die. And he makes the pragmatic choice. And then, of course, is vilified, although he's 100% correct, by the way. And now this is probably the last act of the film where things might get divisive for some audience members. They're trying to tie together this whole entire mythology, and we see one of the canisters from Prometheus. So they've gotten their hands on this original compound. It looks like they've been running research on different creatures. We find out from the Ian Holm character, from Rook, that the plan was to make superhumans, because humans are too fragile in space. But these creatures are not. They can survive anything. So if they could blend them together, and we see some video recording of this mouse that's been injected with this new DNA combo. Of course, moments later, we find out things did not turn out well from the mouse, as it turned into this completely deformed combination creature. And as they're trying to escape this ship, Andy, by the way, has taken this material with him because he knows that the only way to get onto the escape pod is to bring this with them, since the protocols will scan for it and allow it to escape, because that was the original mission, apparently. But as they work their way deeper and deeper into the guts of the ship, we see one of these nests that have been built by the creatures. Apparently, there's not just one or two of them. There are dozens or hundreds of them. And they're about to make their escape, but no, they hear Kay. And of course, Tyler, the original captain of this whole entire mission, has discovered also along the way that he's the father of the child that Kay's pregnant with, and he can't leave her behind. Kay makes her escape with Rain. Andy has been trapped back in the ship, sacrificed himself. It's pretty messed up after all this, willing to sacrifice everybody's life to go back and save one person. They leave Andy behind, but Rain in the end actually can't. Once again, another mistake, by the way. She gives Kay the goop, tells her to make it to the escape pod. Kay injects herself with that mouse-altering chemical, just a wing and a prayer here that it might work. Another terrible decision. And Rain goes back to save Andy, takes out his other programming where he reverts back to his simple version of himself. But of course, at this point, they are completely surrounded by these aliens. And then we have a protracted couple of action sequences that are really excellent here at the end. One involves this basically rules of the game that have been established that the aliens can actually be shot because their blood will actually eat through the hull, which of course will breach the entire ship and kill everybody anyway. But of course, they can deactivate the gravity, and she decides to shoot all the creatures. And then of course, you end up with all this floating acid that they have to maneuver in between. Very cleverly done. And then this another excellent and protracted action sequence inside of an elevator shaft. First, the elevator won't operate because gravity's been turned off, but then actually that allows them to move freely through the elevator shaft. But Andy and Rain get separated, and then when the gravity is reactivated, that same elevator is used to smash up dozens of these approaching aliens. And this is about the time when the ship starts to deteriorate. Another really beautiful visual is the ship being taken apart as it grinds into the rings around this planet. And phew, they made it. They're about to make their escape. But wait a second. Kay is giving birth. We knew that was going to happen. And boy, she gives birth to this alien pod, which then hatches open, and this bizarre humanoid combination creature comes out of it. And now here's where we've made shout-outs to other films in the series. We're shouting out Alien Resurrection here. This creature is looking for mommy, and he needs to nurse. And then the last segment of the film is Rain trying to escape from this creature. And a very cool escape at the end, too, as she detaches part of this mining rig. And she's basically suspended on this cable. And her and Andy escape on the pod and set their destination to this far-off planet. And they will live happily ever after, I'm sure. Although we know from seeing Aliens that maybe they survive, but everybody on the planet dies somehow because one of those aliens gets onto that mining colony. And that's what sets in motion the plot for Aliens from 1986. Now, where does the franchise go from here? I do worry a little bit that after seeing this, a very satisfying action thriller, and really appreciating the fact that they have taken things way back, scaling them back away from these more philosophical elements of the series and gone action, adventure, and corporate conspiracy, all things that were there in the very first film. So I do appreciate that, but where do you go for an entire series? You got to have more meat on the bones than that. You can't just have aliens chasing people around ships in every single episode. That's not going to work, I don't think, although there will definitely be some of that, I'm sure. So yeah, it makes me this is a very fungible concept for a movie series, so they can go in many different directions. I do worry that a 7 or 10 hour story will not be successful here, though. However, I'm very curious to see what they do. And as I mentioned, even when this series fails, and I think it has failed on some of these installments, there are still some really fascinating elements. There are definitely thoughtful decisions being made in each of these. Even when they miss the mark, they're still interesting. And we've seen some pretty bad installments in this franchise, and it has not destroyed this movie series. So I'm sure whether this television series is successful or not, we'll be seeing more of these. All right, I hope you enjoyed that. The next topic I will probably be covering is industry. I'll be reviewing the first 2 episodes of this most recent season. And at the top of that episode, I'll make the pitch for why you should be watching this show if you haven't caught up with it yet. It's available on HBO Max. And then, as I mentioned, probably some short episodes over the course of the week covering some of these topics. A slew of new things on Apple TV. Which ones are worth watching, which ones are not. The House of the Dragon finale. Controversial finale. I have many things to say. And The Boys as well. Most people are pretty enthusiastic about that series. I actually am not. And maybe I'm a contrarian on that, but have some things to say about that as well. So look forward to all of that, hopefully over the course of the next week or so. Until the next episode, I hope you find something new to watch, and I'll talk to you soon.